So yeah, there's three of us here.
Mhm.
Maybe some more will show up.
Yeah, I just posted the link in the Discord, so in
Yep.
case anyone didn't have it.
Yeah, I hadn't seen the agenda yet, so now I'm reading through all of this.
Yeah, so I thought that might be the case. So what we had planned to talk about was, well, we were kind of, I don't know, I think we said something about the laying team proposals that I'm putting forward, but I have kind of twisted it and grown it into this idea of project groups and what step we can take around them. And maybe a good idea is to start. I figured that like not everybody would have read everything, and it might be useful to just start by talking about the idea. The ideas. Probably Aaron is pretty up to date, but
well, don't waste time just to give me context. So
well, it's been a lot of time. It's also, who knows, someone on the internet might.
Yeah,
that is also a thing, and then you have a recording of explaining this. That's true.
I mean, the core ideas. So Russ currently has this idea of teams, which are sort of persistent groups of people that make decisions around various areas. And then we have these domain working groups, which are kind of the same thing, except they sort of don't make official decisions, except that they sort of do. I don't know. There's some debate about what exactly the difference is, but depends what official means, I guess. But anyway, they basically have the mandate of exploring a given area, like embedded development or CLI programming, and the idea was that they can like create shared libraries and or just have a place for people to talk, and share ideas. There's nothing else. And sort of after that, and we kind of, I don't remember exactly how the history went here, but we took this term working group and started using it for also ways to organize within teams. So the compiler, actually, I think it may have predated the domain working group, but I'm not sure. It doesn't matter. So like within the compiler, we might have a working group to pursue a specific idea. And what I'm kind of advocating for is that we should rename those to project groups, and that we should give them a little more structure. And especially, well, when the idea is implementing my example of something within the compiler is one case. That's probably not the most interesting case, like where it's really confined to one element of Rust. But what happens a lot is when you have some Rust feature or some other project, it often has a kind of cross-cutting aspect to it. It involves a couple different teams. So it might start out as the design part, and then there's an implementation phase, and then it has to be documented, and we need to decide if we're going to ship it. And those are all kind of the domain of different teams. Right? And so the idea of the project group would be to sort of have a persistent set of people pushing this feature through the pipeline from start to finish. Whereas today, we kind of have this weird handoff where like the laying team approves the design, we open an issue and it just hangs out there. And maybe the compiler team chooses to implement it, or somebody just does, and the compiler team has to review it. But there's not a lot of kind of coordination. Sometimes somebody carries it through, but sometimes nobody does. And then one thing that can happen is that features just stall out for years somewhere in the pipeline, because the person who cared only got it so far, and then they stopped caring for one reason or another. So what I was thinking, well, what the project group would be then would be like, when we want to start a piece of work that we know will take some time to complete, we create a project group with an RFC, and that work then gets an associated repository that will contain design documents and whatever else we might want in it. And the idea would be then that we can also sort of have a dedicated channel where people can talk, and we do the design. We do a little bit more, we start this process a little earlier. Like right now, the first RFC comes and a design is already sort of done. I mean, a lot of times it iterates, but at least a first draft of the design is done. And this might start earlier when we know we want to solve the problem. We have a vague idea of the solution, but we haven't worked out all the details. And that way we can start having the conversation, you kind of have that conversation in different forums than GitHub.
Yeah.
And the idea would be then that they produce in the early phases, they sort of produce RFCs as they go along, these project groups, for the decision. Once they come to a consensus and they work with some teams to, like, they're not making the end decisions, the teams are, because the idea is that these are also a set of people who, like, it's a way for people to get into the project. So they don't have a lot of authority, but they can iterate on the design and make a recommendation and explain why. And say, we came to this design for this reason and that reason. And that becomes an RFC. Hopefully then the RFC process itself is like significantly faster because most of the iteration has taken place in the context of this project group.
Yeah.
So the thing that I thought might be useful that we don't have, we've just sort of started to do this de facto, which is okay. But it seems like now that we've got a few of them going, it might be useful to actually propose the idea itself and give it some structure and help people get familiar with it. And that was what I was thinking we could talk about.
Yeah, as also to make other teams aware, because the Lang team has started using this, but other teams, when they spin up these similar types of things, they tend to just use the same terminology or the old stuff.
Right. Yeah. So I think there would be a couple goals. One of them would be just getting the terminology out there and sort of defining what is a working group, what is a project group, when should you use which one, and what is a shepherd, which we can talk about in a second, and so on. And yeah, just that's like one half of it, I guess, right? Just clearing up some of that confusion that's latent. How successful an RFC will be with that, I don't know, but at least there'll be something to point to when people say, well, what is a working group? We decided that right over here. I think and to that end, I guess, Aaron, you had this RFC right here that you had started, this draft RFC, which was mostly about defining terminology, if I remember.
Yep.
Yeah. I was just reviewing that, so.
Terminology and sort of expectations around like what they can do, but not sort of the procedural aspects, like how do they operate, sort of more what can they do in terms of in relation to the organization itself.
Yeah, this carries a lot of this actually says a lot, maybe slightly more than I remembered it saying, which is good.
But yeah, there was a lot of iteration.
Yeah.
I don't know if examples belong in an RFC, but when you're sort of letting folks know about this, it might be good to give some examples, like the examples that you gave when you were explaining this earlier, for just to help folks build a mental model. I don't know if it would be a plan to also go to existing groups and say, hey, this is a new way of approaching this. How can we help you sort of shift in that direction? And this is where I'm not remembering all the stuff I learned about change management, but this is where change management would come in as well, in regard to helping folks feel comfortable with that kind of a change and see how it might benefit them, particularly on the projects. It sounds like the projects, the places where maybe lack of a shepherd has more of an impact, or is more common, rather.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm trying to decide how worried I get. I think adding examples definitely makes sense. One of the question marks, I guess, this RFC was at least initially kind of written with the idea of it's going to write down what some things mean and kind of document the de facto state. But there is a slightly more aggressive variation where it's saying we're really proposing a shift in how development happens, which was actually, I guess that's kind of what my draft RFC was about, wherever I wrote it. Did I even link to it? No.
There was a link on Discord, and then I wasn't sure what it was, and I hadn't gone back to it again. So yeah, I should have read that before this meeting.
I linked to my blog post, which links to an RFC, but I didn't link directly to it.
Actually, no, it just said status update. I thought that was the RFC.
This proposal was saying that maybe we should like summarize a little more what these different things are.
Yeah, I saw the project group template and the channel and the WG status update. So I didn't realize you'd had the blog post. I didn't know to look there. I'm sorry.
No worries. I'm trying to sort it out myself. There's a lot of pieces floating around. So we've got like defining terminology. I'm putting this in the wrong place, aren't I?
I'm just gonna stop.
There, type, go for it. We've got a sort of defining terminology. We've got changing the Lang team process. So what this RFC was basically saying was, today, when you have an idea of something you want to do, you open an RFC. That's kind of the start of the process from the formal point of view. And we would change that so that the start is, you basically can't open an RFC without first getting a Lang team sponsor. And so we have a separate process for sort of submitting an idea, saying you want to sponsor, but the expectation is that those sponsor requests might take a long time, right? Like that's kind of the request, the funnel in, and the RFC repo is more for stuff that's ongoing, which lets us move things faster through there when we're actually trying to get stuff done, or ideas that we have actually decided to do. And I guess that's a sort of distinct concept, but there's overlap.
There's also, well, for the RFC repo specifically, there isn't just Lang team stuff there. There has been one example is the original governance RFC. I'm sure there are other RFCs I'm not thinking about, but as we have to figure out how this applies to other teams as well.
Right, there's lots of teams. Yeah, I think that's right. I wanted to start it from the point of view of the Lang team only because I sort of wanted to do it step by step. If it's working well, maybe encourage other teams.
Well, then perhaps that would be some kind of way to stage it, is you would have a team that would sort of have a model of it for a couple of months and then say, hey, this is how we did this. This is how this could benefit you. Yeah, because it seems like one thing would be to have an example and another thing would be to say, well, how does this benefit you? How does this help you be more effective? How does this help Rust as a whole be more effective? The sort of what's in it for you part.
One problem I noticed putting this into practice was that we have a team repository, right? As we saw in the last time we talked, that defines all the teams. And it doesn't have the idea of a project group in it. And it only has the idea of a working group. It enforces a few rules. So let's see. Specifically, the problems I ran into, let's see, no shepherd metadata. So you can define leaders, but the idea of a shepherd was this is somebody, it's a sort of, I guess it is the same as a leader, but it's a special name. And the idea was it's supposed to be the person or people who are leading the discussion, working with people and so on, and that they may or may not be on the team. They're just sort of leading around this topic. But I would sort of prefer to write shepherd, right? I think if we have the concept, we should use the term.
And there's also no liaison, no way to specify this is the person who's communicating from one team to another.
Right. And I think you would want to be able to have multiple liaisons. Plus, you had to name the group WG Foo. Would prefer Project Foo. So that was where when I saw this problem is where I came to the idea of we should make an RFC that says we're going to introduce project groups. Here's what they have. And we have like a repository template, and they have a little structure. And it seems like that's an independent concept from the actual ranking process, right? Like you can make that, as we're already doing, you can just sort of say this is what we have. And then you can say now we're kind of routing so that things have to go through there as opposed to they may go through there. And I guess your RFC, or I mean this draft RFC kind of, it's not quite structured that way, but it has a lot of the information, right?
Yeah.
The only difference might be its focus or organization somehow or something. Like the summary doesn't say, for example, proposes a new.
Yeah.
You might want it to be like Pound defines a working group and proposes a new structure called a project group, which some of the existing working groups can be rebranded.
I mean, having that kind of clear distinction could be helpful because then if you think about it, it wouldn't just be about having the shepherds for the project groups. If the project groups are associated with domain groups, then that's another layer of someone knowing what's going on,
right?
In a way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in fact, I think some of the more organized domain groups have a structure much like this. They themselves have projects within them.
It might be something to model for folks who wouldn't necessarily think of it to start out with, but also maybe to not just to say, hey, you should do things this way, but also to find a way to explain to folks, hey, this is why doing things this way is useful.
Actually, that reminds me.
Yeah, that also reminds me of, I remember reading the Mozilla blog post about them changing chat platforms. And there was an interesting idea there where they were going to spin up 3 instances, but then at the end of the time, I think it was like 6-9 months, we were just going to shut them all down and then sort of talk about it and decide which one was going to be best. And I sort of think it might be a good idea to have something similar, not necessarily shutting it down, but having like a timed retrospective, like, okay, after this so much time, we're going to post exactly about whether this worked, whether this didn't work, sort of essentially like promising that we will provide like some output of how this went.
That sounds like a great idea. I mean, having postmortems or plus deltas is a good way to say, are we accomplishing the goals that this is supposed to accomplish? And if we aren't, how can we adjust?
So, okay, maybe we can write the RFC summary essentially that we're talking about. It sounds like we're saying define domain working group terminology. It's kind of it's kind of a side, it's not the main focus, but it's just a thing. Introduce project group concept, shepherd, the key aspects are shepherd, team liaisons. I can't spell that word, by the way. It's just the hardest word to spell. I think it has another I or something in there.
That's right. You have it right now.
Yeah. It's French.
Yes.
Shepherds, team liaisons, repository, discussion, dedicated discussion area, Zulip stream.
And maybe also associated with a domain working group. And in other words, not floating off on its own.
It has
a report team.
I think all of them actually, but have a parent team or domain working group. Yeah.
Except the team's going away. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say that's kind of one of the main distinctions between like a project group and a domain working group is the domain working group has to be approved by the core team. It has to go through a much longer process than a project
Yeah.
group.
I've always assumed that they kind of have a parent team, which is core, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It might be
Yeah,
good to just
yeah,
go ahead.
sure. Sorry.
I think I'm just going to turn on video because then I can nod and like other things and not say, oh, wait, I'm not giving nonverbals.
One thing I wish Zoom had is stickers or something. Like a peer.in or whatever it's called now, it has some other name, had some kind of thing where you could click a button and it would like show a head going like this.
Yes.
Anyway. So, all right, well, this is the core parts of I guess the next part is the process, right? Process of creating a project group, which is RFC approved by parent team, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I think my view is that project groups are kind of a cross-cutting, or they may have a cross-cutting character to them, but I still think at least the Lang team ones, but I still think it makes sense for the
I think some
parent
will
team to be the
only
Lang
be related to
team.
one team.
What's
Say
that?
again?
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, like, for example, like teams, it could be one, or it could be like there could be project groups that are like shared between like release and infra, for example.
Yeah,
That would be one of the very common ones, but sometimes it'll just be only one specific team.
yeah.
Well, it might be nice if there's one that's sort of the domain or the parent team of record or something like that. Because then at least there's a default. So ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's no reason to require it to be one, but I think in practice it will be nicer often if there's a main team, if only because it's annoying to get, like our approval process is a lot of people have to check boxes, and that's just annoying. And especially for like if it's like Lang and compiler, there's a lot of people on the compiler team, and most of them don't care. There's no reason to make them check any boxes.
I think it should probably be like whoever is the liaisons. Whoever's on the liaisons are probably also the team that cares the most.
That was my assumption. Yeah, is that it? Like, I guess it starts in one team, and well, I think it's not a big deal. It'll be a parent team, and each parent team provides a liaison, and that seems fine. So the RFC should be approved. Repository is created in the Rust-Lang org. A team repository, the GitHub, what is it called? Rust-Lang/team repo is updated. Oh, I think there's another concept that is not. Whoa. I think membership is meaningful, and we should talk about it a little bit. Like, in part, we recently hit this question right around the Rust all hands, and this question of like, who's a member of the Rust organization? When you have groups where people can become members with very little effort, because that may be relevant. If you're saying like I'm going to subsidize all members, then you start to care how much work did they do, or so I think we should talk about what membership means and the threshold for it, which should not be 0, basically. But repository, that's what happens, and then that's sort of it. And then we said something about a retrospective after some period of time to review how this structure is working. We need to create a project group, which I guess the project group is the governance working group.
Is the governance working group.
One thing that would be helpful is if you're reviewing how the structure is working might be if there are initial goals to articulate what those initial goals are, because then you can evaluate, okay, how is it working, not just against okay, how do people feel about it? But hey, we had these goals when we suggested this, and this is how this served or didn't serve these goals, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's very wise.
Yeah,
And
or the goals changed over time.
yeah,
They can change, and maybe that's even part of the retrospective is, hey, we had these goals, but actually we should have these. But to be explicit about what the objectives are. Yeah.
so I'm just going to throw out some ideas, but I'd like to hear what other people think the goals are. I think one of them is to ensure follow through for projects as they move through design, implement through phases like design and implementation and stabilization. I think one of them is to build a community around the feature, like people working together, and to avoid
also, yeah, having essentially not letting the project go stale, or the feature not having an answer to like, what is the status of this?
yeah, that's kind of what I meant by follow through.
Yeah.
Let's see, not letting feature go stale, that part for sure. The answer to the project is the status is different though. I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
So answer to what is the status, or at least where can I find it? Oh, that reminds me, the repository, the purpose of the repository is, I'll come back to that. I wanted to add, there's another aspect of this, which is like also the question of what are all the things that the Rust project is doing, which is really hard to answer right now. And if those were sort of, if at least the major ones are lifted into the form of project groups, then you can answer it by looking at the project groups.
Yeah, that could even be boiled down as, visibility of.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Good term.
Visibility into current active project endeavors, projects.
And that kind of just means priorities.
Say again?
Community priorities is kind of what that is, in a way. That people in and outside of the community can see what is being, allocated time and resources and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's going to be like more and more true. Right now, it's kind of it's definitely not true now because there's so much happening that's not captured, but it's becoming more true, which is cool. I think the reason to add a repository is something else, right? Right now, we have a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for, like transients or something. When you want to come back and find the reasoning for a given decision, or
ephemera.
Or I guess that's the biggest one. The reasoning and some of the iterations that happened, it's kind of lost.
The reasoning for creating repos, are these all buried in RFCs then?
Or I think the reasons behind how did the feature get to this point? Probably the best example of the documentation we have is probably the module RFC, because that was so controversial. Aaron Turin wrote a lot of really good blog posts about all the iterations through that. We don't have the same quality of that for every single feature.
Right, so we don't know what happened and what influenced specific decisions. Sometimes, what people will often say when I say this is that the RFCs do contain an alternative section, and in a very well-written RFC, it's definitely true that some of that logic, gets moved, so or version is. But in practice, A, it often doesn't happen, and B, I find that it wants to be very condensed, that section. And it might be nice if you could have it a more, like, just put the old draft somewhere, and here it is, and then you can look at it, you know, or more details. But the other aspect is guiding the conversation and avoiding rehashing disputes. I don't know that this will, we haven't actually seen this play out, but my theory is that with the repository, we can do things like create frequently asked questions and so on. And when people ask those questions, we can direct them and close the issue.
That's also very good for onboarding, because one of the things I was thinking about related to this, although I think it doesn't have a home in what you're saying right now yet, but I know you could imagine people saying, I want to start a project, what do I do? And you could have an FAQ item. Well, this is how a project starts, and this is the flow. And an FAQ would be a great place to have that kind of info, I imagine. So, and not about replicating what's in an RFC necessarily, but even just saying, hey, here is this RFC, or if there are multiple relevant RFCs, the string of RFCs. So.
I guess, yeah, that's right. I think another related point is like some features like infiltrate get done piecemeal, where there are many RFCs that build and layer the feature over time. And that's kind of ties in with some of the things we've said here. I don't know, like follow through, but it's really hard to track the overall state of what has happened when you have all these individual RFCs that are like just doing a little bit at a time. And also when there's not the follow through, then the set of people, the design, like it goes over years and the people change and they forget. The institutional history is not memories.
Yeah, another good example is like the macros 2.0. It's like the slow progress towards that. It's been happening over the past few years, but it's hard to pin down where exactly that state is. Yeah,
these are maybe more, I don't think these are like, I feel like these two examples didn't add new bullet points. They just gave examples of why that would, some of these bullet points would be important.
That's still useful as a saying, well, why are we doing this? Well, here's some examples of why we're doing this.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's why I'm breaking it into a separate section is all. Of infiltrate. Okay. I won't go into the details of why, but. I think another thing with infiltrate highlights is this. Well, I don't know exactly where, but I think of the roadmaps, sort of being able to see the status of here's the overall picture we're moving to, and here's where we are in the process. I think that should be a high priority for project groups, and I hope that they will use repositories to do it. I wonder if there's a way to bake it a little more into the process, like an actual thing that you produce is this roadmap, kind of like your charter.
Yeah, templates, that's changeable. Because when you were just saying that, I was like, I wonder how much it would help folks. On the one hand, you don't want to nail them down, but on the other hand, if they have to I'm trying to come up with analogies that are clever and I can't at 11 o'clock at night. So I will just say, if they have to build all of their stuff themselves, they're more likely then that uses up energy that they can be using to actually make stuff. And so maybe having more templates like this would free up folks' mental space for just making stuff. And they wouldn't feel too pinched providing templates.
I think a key thing we found elsewhere is that templates are good, but especially for roadmaps, we haven't really, it's really hard to make one. And what we probably need is active mentoring and bandwidth. But it should be in the template.
Yeah, a roadmap in particular is hard.
Say again?
I was just saying, a roadmap in particular is pretty hard because we're all volunteers, so it's very hard to measure time because people don't have. It's not like people are dedicating 9 to 5 and they know they have this many hours that they can dedicate to Rust.
See, I wasn't. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
The thing is, I mean, I know roadmaps usually involve time, but I was even thinking about just I wasn't even thinking of it in the official project sense, but just like, what is the intention what is the goal for this project and what is the path intended to be, that folks should be following, but then less concern about the timing, because yeah, if everybody's a volunteer, that's nuts with the timing.
One thing I don't actually think of roadmaps as having timing, to be honest. I think of them as here are the stages we're working on. But even so, it's a big upfront investment of time, and it requires like it's especially hard for a volunteer who doesn't have as much context sometimes. They know they want this, but they don't know how it fits in. One thing I was going to say is I think there's a separate thing, which is separate decision to address problem from solution. Like right now, when you make an RFC, you're kind of combining, I see a problem and I have a proposal and all these things into one. And I think we would really we probably do want to know that we have like some ideas for how to fix the problem. You know, we don't think we want to approve a project group where we just literally have no concept of what they could even do. But at the same time, we would rather that we start earlier.
It's very difficult to also, to be like, I have this problem, and for a lot of people to come up with a solution, and then people will propose that solution, and then there will be just a ton of feedback about how that solution not work, because obviously it's the first iteration. But that doesn't change that the problem is still a problem, even though maybe their initial solution is not enough.
I'm not sure if this is helpful, but based on what you just said, it might be nice to add a note somewhere about when you're thinking about providing templates, providing sort of labor-saving pre-thinking for folks, having some kind of postmortem or plus delta that project teams can periodically do and say, hey, is this following the path we meant it to be following? Is this going in the right direction? Do we want to do something else? Are we solving the problem we were trying to solve? Do we have different problems that have to fork off or something? I don't know. I think that's more meta even than we're at right now, but what you said just now made me think of this.
I think it's a good idea, and we found it to be a little hard to do. Maybe that comes to the other sections of the RFC template. There's sort of alternatives, which I don't know what we would write there, but there's something like drawbacks, right?
Yeah.
Or I don't know if I'd call it exactly a drawback, but I think there's certainly some overhead, like things we have found in experience doing this elsewhere. There's definitely overhead in creating and maintaining these repos, documents, etc. And
especially, well, in the past when it's been contributors who are mainly interested in something else, but they create this and maintain this because they want to get this initial thing done, but they want to create it, but they don't necessarily want to maintain it. It's kind of more of the thing. It's like people want to do like the initial effort, but they don't necessarily want to be the person who maintains it forever.
Yes. I think that's actually like, right. And I think that's a huge part of the problem with the follow-through question. I guess I see that as both a drawback and an advantage to this. We can try to pair up people with someone who's going to be there longer term, even if they're not.
Well, it's also partly, I think project groups should have kind of a sort of apoptosis built in, not like a deadline, but an expectation that they will dissolve once the project the thing that they were that they set out to address is resolved. And I also think that that kind of retrospective that I think Val was mentioning is, it might kind of naturally come out of that discussion about dissolving a project group.
Yeah, that's
I think
yeah.
that is like,
I'm just
sorry, I was gonna say that's actually one I would say one with working groups at the moment is that there's no clear dissolution process, so it's not clear. Like I remember I was talking to you, Nico, about which working groups are actually still active, so we can figure it out on the team side.
Yes.
Yeah, like it can be hard. Like it's hard for like even people inside the wrestling organization to know what things are active because there is no strict deadlines. Well, yeah, not a strict deadline, but end. Like there's never really things kind of fade. They don't kind of stop.
One of the original, in the compiler team, we originally said that we would review, we would sort of have regular updates from the working groups. And that, you know, if 3 or 4 weeks went by without updates, we would start to talk about whether the team did. Now that did not work out quite how we planned it, because first of all, that was just much too ambitious. Like it's very easy for 3 or 4 weeks or updates to go by and no progress without the thing being dead. But although it is interesting, but it is definitely possible. But like it might be a sign we're doing too much actually. But what I would say is, even though it hasn't quite worked out like that, it still sort of has. For example, we have the LLEM working group. It's been pretty inactive since it was founded, and we are now talking about closing it down because I think in large part the people who are listed as leads are tired of getting pinged to ask for updates when they don't have any. So like we don't have a formal process, but just the fact that we regularly ping people alone creates a certain incentive to be like, yeah, you know what, this is just not happening. It's okay. We'll come back to it later some other time. So
that's, sorry. That's kind of the negative path to dissolution. I think for project group, there's also kind of a positive achieved the thing. So maybe in the current RFC template, there's a section, and I think maybe that it could be a recommendation that when a project group may post an RFC, in the work section, they could say whether that RFC, once it's merged, would be good to discuss wrapping up the project group. And then when the RFC does merge, they would say, hey, let's have a meeting to see if we still need the group.
Unfortunately, I don't know if others have this problem, but I couldn't really hear most of what you said.
Yeah,
I also had this a little bit.
Sorry, I'm in not a great. I'm using my phone. The idea is just that we could recommend that project groups, when they merge an RFC, or even when they open a pull request with an RFC, that in the template section that says future work, they could include an item saying, we think that after this RFC is merged, we should have a discussion about, you know, whether this project group has met its intended purpose, fulfilled its purpose, and should be dissolved. Or, you know, have an item saying there is enough work to do that we think the project group should stick around.
I like that idea. My only caveat would be that I think it's a throw. Given our current process, unfortunately, I think we could change this. RFCs tend to be like the start, not the end, often, because they're like, here's a design, and then we have to implement and stabilize. But especially I would like us to be moving to like a model where we're doing more RFCs, and I kind of think we should just also move stabilization decisions and other decisions into RFCs. Like that should just be our decision-making place. In which case it would make a lot of sense, exactly as you said it. But regardless, I think encouraging, like encourage, when you have a longer lived project group, encouraging them to use the future work to lay out the roadmap they expect to be doing themselves. Like, here's the work we're doing. This is step 1. Here's steps 2 and 3 that we expect to do. At that point, once that's stabilized, like, this will be done. There is additional work. One could imagine that that would be for some future project group to do.
It sounds like then some kind of guidance both on what would, maybe this is somewhere and I haven't seen it, but on what about the life cycle of a project, about the idea, well, what's a project? If you think about it in the project management definition, a project is a thing that has a start and an end and a goal. And so I get the sense that in the initial RFCs, the goal is being defined, but then I don't know, and maybe, and there's lots of ways one could think about how to approach this. How many RFCs for projects are kind of, how do I put this, kind of big and hazy, and then it's harder to finish?
I don't think that's it's partially a problem, the big hazy problem, I mean. But I think there's definitely a problem of, we spend a lot of time iterating to find, sometimes a design has a lot of moving parts, and a single RFC can stay a long time until all those things are in alignment, even if there are parts that have reached consensus. I'm thinking about maybe some part of this RFC might be a recommendation for how project groups use RFCs. And that's what I wrote here, you can see, but that they might move towards smaller incremental RFCs, which we've already considered best practice in some sense. But what we're missing is the superstructure, right? And that's what we're adding now. And that these RFCs put themselves in the greater context of the project group as a whole. So use the future work section to identify the steps the group expects to do, as well as those that it does not, but which a future group might do. I would say that in our experience in the compiler, at least, groups that actually finish is less, like, we're winding down. That's been okay. It's not, people recognize when they feel the work is done, and I don't think that's been controversial in any sense to wind down those groups. It's not like people want to hang on to the group after they're finished, they're ready to be done.
I don't think it's ever been like controversial. I would just say it's more been a communication where it's never been clear.
That's true. It's kind of annoying work to do, so it gets put off for one thing, like pure procedural work. The exciting stuff is done. The other part that has happened, like around the NLL, which is a big compiler feature, there's a long tail of follow-up work, and it's not exactly clear where to draw the line and say, okay, we're done now. This group is. So that was a sort of discussion that I think we ended up having it, but it took a while. It could have been happening faster.
Oops. So did it get figured out, or is that still something to benchmark when a project can file its "we are done" RFC? Is that still something that would be valuable, not now, but in general, to determine, to support this clarification?
I don't think it's something we can really say much about. It did get determined in that instance. I don't think you need an RFC also to like, I don't think we should, that's just kind of too annoying to close down. It should just be, okay, we agreed. But I think what's missing a little bit, and I kind of hinted at it here in some of these drawbacks or maybe future developments, is that really the teams need to adapt. Like, we can create project groups, but teams need to integrate them into their structure and have some times when they like look over and think about it. And that part, I think we don't quite know what is the best way for teams to do that. And maybe there won't be one best way, but I think we can't exactly answer it until we have more groups. I guess my hope is that we'll get to a place where the teams themselves are like, they are encapsulating their work in groups And I would I'd like to have the Lang team have a rule that's sort of like, you can be involved in 2 groups at a time or something. And therefore, when you want to do something new, you better finish up the old one, because you kind of can't start a new group right now. Procedurally, we won't list it.
Is that written down somewhere? That thing you said about not overextending yourself?
It's written in the Lang team RFC that I referred to, or at least I think it is.
Okay.
Certainly hinted at.
It's definitely one of the Shepherd I think also in the Shepherd stuff.
That might be something we could put. I feel like it's a little out of scope for this RFC that we're drafting here, but they're probably in this future work section. I think it would be a good place to say, like, we suggest this. Consider, or maybe it might be in scope if we had a section that was like, what are the considerations that should go into deciding whether to accept a project group RFC? Actually, I think that would be a good thing to talk about. And one of them probably is, how overstretched are the shepherds and the liaison? Are they involved in a lot of other things? If so, this work will probably stall, and that's not good. Actually, I wrote something about this recently.
Yeah, I think having a section where, like, not just talking about these groups, but also how a team can integrate, and how can a team adopt the workflow that we're proposing.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's see. That's a little more general, I guess. Yeah, integrating project groups into team workflow. Considerations when creating a project group are the shepherds, liaisons. I think some other examples might be like, I think like for Lang team features, we might talk about, we might have enough people right now, but do we think we'll have enough people to finish the work all the way down? The set of requirements changes.
Yeah, like how big is the scope in a sense? Like, do you have enough people to see the work?
Right. Go on.
I was going to say, and is the scope clear? Is the goal and the scope of the project clear? Clear as in maybe find some way to codify it. And I'm probably doing this wrong, but for example, we want to blah so that, or something like that. I mean, that's not the best example, but you get what I mean. Something that's really concrete.
Yep. We recently had this RFC to create the Safe Transmute project group, and I tried to put a little context for just sort of an experimental comment on my part. I just wanted to review what I wrote here. But I think this is the kind of thing, I would love to have an actual template of like, if we had a template for the RFC to create a project group, it might include like directions for the thread to help guide people on the right things. Like one of the things I would say is,
just as a heads up, we've 4 minutes left now.
Thanks for bringing that up. About 6 minutes ago, I was meaning to point out that we had 10 minutes, and then I forgot. Someone was saying something too interesting. All right, we should probably stop. I just wanted the sentence I was going to say is that I think there's definitely room to raise technical objections, but I think it's also a valid way to resolve them to say, we will file that to be figured out. Like, this is not a time when it's like a little bit fuzzy, but like, I think we have to work on that. But
it's sort of like whether a concern is blocking or not. Right.
Like, only if the technical objection is like so fundamental that the whole idea that has been like, there's just completely falls apart, that's one thing. But if it's like, okay, it's kind of complicated, but we think it can be worked out, then that's not a reason to stall. You should just say, good, we register this objection. It should be noted somewhere for the project group, but like, let's move on. I think there are some guidelines from the TC39 stages. I have to look. Anyway, so what are the next steps? So we've kind of got a pretty cool draft.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of an outline of an RFC here. It seems like it's adapting the one that you started, Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to try to take some of this and bring it into that draft?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And then we won't have another meeting until mid-January.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to raise on that topic, as you probably should have raised earlier, was at this point we've had 3 meetings on 3 distinct topics.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we probably don't want to grow. I'm worried we will sort of grow our scope too much if we just keep having meetings on topics.
Different topics.
We should sort of revisit some things and see are we done with them, what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be helpful also, I wasn't sure if you just were talking and I interrupted you, or?
No.
Okay, and I know we have 2 minutes. I was going to say one thing that I'm wondering if it could be helpful, and I'm probably missing some context, but to maybe think about what are the goals of the governance group, over the next year, for example, and how the things that have already been addressed fit into that in the past 3 meetings, including this one, and sort of, looking at the big picture and sort of, you see what I'm going with that? Yeah, I'm having trouble finishing that sentence.
We're telling everyone they need a charter, but our charter is a little unclear, in other words.
Yeah.
we sort of have taken a few stabs at it, but I think it wouldn't hurt to revisit it. Maybe that is a topic. Like maybe the next topic should be a retrospective on how we've done and sharpen our charter for the next year. So status update and sharpen. Go on. Sorry.
Either that or with enough time, we should just do this topic again, because it's enough time that there will be enough progress in this topic that will be worth discussing again.
Yep. So in 2 weeks, it's the 31st. We're obviously not going to do it then.
Yeah.
The 7th comes after that.
Well,
or we just stick to the cycle and we go to the 14th. Let the calendar invites play out.
Yeah, that doesn't bother me, though. We probably want to. Action items probably making a doodle for the next year.
If we want to keep this same slot, you mean?
Yeah. Just even change the cadence to be from the 14th to the 7th.
It doesn't bother me either. Nothing changes in my life.
Yeah.
It's all an endless cycle of pleasure and suffering. No. I would be happy to just go on the 14th, honestly, and we could like have an async. We can just, as you say, we've kind of got I think this is a very big work item, and the other things are also fairly big.
Yeah.
We could do some kind of like lightweight pinging on Discord on the 7th, maybe, or something. I don't know. I don't want to make any more doodles in my life, but I'll fill them out if somebody else needs.
Yeah.
As long as someone sends me an email, I'll do something about it. I have to admit, I do look at the Discord like every day or every other day or something, but yeah, I'm not always sure yet still what I'm looking for. So I'm better about email. Sorry.
Seems fine.
Yeah.
Why don't we just say the next meeting is the 14th?
Yeah, for now.
And why don't we leave the topic? Let's say we'll determine the topic on the 7th, but it's either going to be revisiting a specific thing or discussing our charter, sort of.
I vote for the overall charter, but that's me, because then you can go back to the individual stuff with the big picture. But maybe that's also because I'm thinking about 2020 planning right now. That's a big job. So
I was thinking that, yeah, I mean, one thing I was thinking is that I think around that time, the Rust project itself will be starting a kind of roadmap. And I feel like we might want to talk. One of the items I expect to be around governance and financial considerations and so on, and what the role of the governance working group is in that is an interesting question. So shall we say there's a mini Discord meeting on the 7th to figure it out. I can make a calendar entry for that so I don't forget.
And I'll note it down. Same time, I assume?
I guess so. Works for me if it works for you all.
Well, it wouldn't, but I'm shifting because I have to have meetings with California, so it's all good. So, hey, we're officially 3 minutes over time, I guess I should say.
Yep, go to bed.
Good night, good morning, good afternoon.
See you.